Exist places that exist only in memory, untouched by time, perfect in their immutability. For Leo, the clearing in Blackwood Forest was one of those sanctuaries. It was there that, a decade earlier, he and his best friend Miguel had witnessed a meteor shower that redefined the concept of magic for two 12-year-old boys. Now, at 22, the trip was a pilgrimage, an almost desperate attempt to recapture an echo of that wonder. Leo, with his meticulously hand-drawn maps from memory and an almost feverish optimism, led the way. Miguel, always the pragmatist, Leo's anchor to reality, followed a step behind, his gaze sweeping the dense foliage with a caution his friend seemed to completely ignore. This wasn't just a camping trip, it was a test, a quest to prove that the magic of the past could still be found in the cynical world of adults. Blackwood Forest was not a place for amateurs. It rose like a wall, a cathedral of sequoias and pines so ancient they seemed to absorb the sound of the outside world. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and sweet decay, a primordial perfume that spoke of cycles of life and death indifferent to human presence. The beauty was undeniable, almost overwhelming. Shafts of sunlight pierced the canopy like divine spotlights, illuminating ferns and carpets of moss in vibrant green. But beneath that beauty, there was an oppressive silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of nature. It was an absence of sound, as if birds and insects had agreed to hold their breath. It was a silence that listened, that weighed on the shoulders and seeped into the thoughts, a constant reminder of their complete and absolute isolation. Leo's obsession with the clearing began 6 months earlier, after a particularly difficult period in his life. He clung to the memory of that night like a castaway to wreckage. He described to Miguel, repeatedly, the sky exploding in streaks of silver and gold, the feeling of being infinitely small, and at the same time, part of something cosmic and immense. It was, for him, the last time the world had seemed to make sense. Miguel agreed to the trip out of loyalty, worried about his friend's fixation, but hoping that confronting the real place, likely less spectacular than the idealized memory, might bring some kind of closure. He carried most of the equipment, a physical burden that mirrored the emotional weight of watching his friend chase a ghost. The problem began with the oak tree. In Leo's memory, an old twisted oak, with a branch that looked like a broken arm pointing toward the sky, marked the entrance to the trail that led to the clearing. They should have found it at least an hour earlier. But the forest unfolding before them was an anonymous labyrinth of identical trunks. Frustration began to erode Leo's optimism. He consulted his hand-drawn map, then the compass, then the phone's GPS, which blinked uselessly in search of signal. It was as if the forest itself were reorganizing, moving its landmarks to confuse them, playing with their perceptions. The trail that seemed right 10 minutes ago now ended abruptly in a wall of thorns. Every step forward seemed to take them deeper into a place that did not want to be found. As afternoon turned into a golden, melancholic dusk, the atmosphere of the forest changed. Beauty gave way to a latent threat. Shadows lengthened, transforming into slender, misshapen creatures that danced at the edge of their vision. The silence, once merely unsettling, now seemed to vibrate with a low, inaudible energy. A resonance felt more in the bones than in the ears. It was Miguel who noticed first. The moss on the tree trunks grew on all sides, not just the north, making any attempt at natural navigation a cruel joke. They weren't just lost. They were being swallowed by a place that operated under its own ancient, incomprehensible rules. The goal was no longer to find the magic of the past, but simply to survive the approaching night. The campfire, now reduced to a pulsing bed of orange embers, cast a weak, flickering light that barely managed to pierce the black velvet of the night. The mountain air, once fresh and invigorating, now felt heavy, laden with the dampness of darkness and the weight of a million silent trees watching them. The sky, an impossible display of stars unseen in the city, seemed vast and indifferent. For Leo, it was the embodiment of peace, the total disconnection he sought. For Miguel, however, the isolation was beginning to transform. The silence wasn't empty. It was a blank canvas, waiting for something to fill it. And the forest, relentless, didn't take long to oblige. The first sound was a fracture. Dry, sharp, unmistakable. the crack of a heavy branch snapping under a weight that shouldn't have been there. It came from the darkness, perhaps 50 meters away. "It's just a deer," Leo said, his voice a little louder than necessary, breaking the tension that had instantly settled. Miguel nodded in agreement, but his eyes remained fixed in the direction of the sound, trying to see beyond the dying light. A deer, of course. The logical explanation, the only one that made sense. But the sound wasn't followed by the rustle of leaves from a fleeing animal. It was followed only by an even deeper silence, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Then came the second noise, and this one was impossible to ignore. It wasn't a crack, but a slow, heavy, dragging sound. A guttural, rhythmic noise, as if something large and rough were being dragged across the forest floor, over leaves and earth. It stopped and started again, in a pattern that belonged to no animal they knew. It wasn't the step of a bear or the trot of a boar. It was methodical, deliberate. Leo's rationalizations began to fail. He suggested a log rolling down a slope, but there was no slope in that direction. Miguel said nothing. The seed of doubt planted by the first crack was beginning to sprout into a cold, creeping fear. What followed was a psychological war waged in silence. Every gust of wind that rattled the tent tarp, every distant hoot of an owl, became a potential threat. The normal sounds of the night were recontextualized, transformed into harbingers of something unknown. They retreated into the tent, the zipper closing with a sharp, final sound, a fragile barrier against the immensity outside. Conversation ceased. There was nothing left to say, no plausible explanation that could calm nerves stretched to the breaking point. They just lay there, eyes open in the dark, listening to the pulse of their own blood in their ears, waiting. And it was at that moment, on the threshold between wakefulness and restless sleep, that the final sound of the night arrived. It wasn't a crack or a drag. It was a whisper. So low it could have been the wind, but it had an organic, sibilant quality. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, but it was terrifyingly close. A sound that slid across the tent fabric and nestled directly into their ears. It wasn't a word. It wasn't a language, but it was undeniably a form of communication. In that instant, Leo and Miguel knew, with chilling certainty, that they were not alone. And whatever was out there was not an animal. The darkness of the second night didn't bring silence, but repetition, a precise and horrifying echo of the previous night's events. It began with the same branch crack, from the same direction, at what felt like the exact same minute. Leo and Miguel exchanged wide-eyed looks over the flickering firelight, a silent recognition passing between them. This was no coincidence. The sequence unfolded like a macabre script, the rustle in the leaves, the sound of something being dragged a short distance, and then the heavy, expectant silence. It was a performance, an involuntary ritual in which they were the only audience. Any attempt to convince themselves it was just a nocturnal animal with regular habits dissolved in the cold air. The regularity was too perfect, too mathematical. It was a deliberate imitation, a mockery that turned the doubt of the first night into a terrifying certainty. At dawn, the sunlight felt like a fragile truce, a golden lie about normalcy. The relief, however, was shattered by a small discovery. Leo's pocket knife, which he was absolutely certain he'd left embedded in a tree trunk beside his backpack, now rested perfectly balanced on a smooth stone 5 meters away. The blade was closed. There were no signs of struggle, no tracks, no indication that an animal had moved it. Just the object, displaced with surgical precision. Miguel, initially skeptical, checked his own belongings. His metal canteen, which had been hanging from a low branch, was now on the ground beside Leo's tent, its cap slightly unscrewed. Denial was a fragile barrier against the rising wave of panic. This wasn't the wind or a curious raccoon. It was a message. The search for more anomalies became an obsessive hunt. They found the small pile of firewood they'd arranged for the morning subtly reconfigured into an almost imperceptible spiral. One of the ropes securing the tarp over the campsite was tied with a different knot, one neither of them recognized. Each discovery was another nail in the coffin of rationality. The changes were minimal, almost insignificant to a casual observer, but to them, they were silent screams. An intelligence was at work, an unseen presence that wasn't just watching them, but interacting with their environment in a methodical, disturbing way. It was a demonstration of control, a way of saying, I am here, I see everything, and I can touch your things whenever I want. The forest, once indifferent, now watched them with 1,000 invisible eyes. The attempt to find a logical explanation became an exercise in futility. You didn't take my knife as a joke? Leo asked, his voice loaded with desperate hope. Miguel's firm denial was followed by the same question, with the same result. The weak, unconvincing mutual accusation died quickly, replaced by shared terror. Could it be another camper, a local hermit playing a prank? The idea was absurd. They'd seen no one for days, there were no nearby trails, and the nature of the disturbances was far too subtle for a simple joke. It was something older, more fundamental. Logic unraveled like smoke against the solid, inexplicable reality of objects out of place. Their world, governed by cause and effect, was disintegrating. Fear, which the night before had been an abstract shadow, now had weight and form. It was no longer just fear of the dark or the unknown. It was fear of a conscious, methodical, invisible presence. An entity that didn't announce itself with roars, but with the silence of a moved pocket knife. Isolation, once a blessing, became a trap. Every tree was a potential hiding place, every shadow a threat. Blackwood Forest was no longer a place of wild beauty, but a chessboard where they were mere pawns, moved by a hand they couldn't see or understand. The question was no longer what are these noises, but what does it want from us? The silence of the third night was different. It wasn't an absence of sound, but a sound in itself, a pressure in the ears, a heavy expectation, and then it was broken. Not by a branch, not by the howl of an animal. It was a low, guttural sound that began as a hum and shaped itself into something terrifyingly familiar. A vowel, a drawn-out A, dragged like a tape being chewed by an old recorder. It came from somewhere among the trees, close, far too close. It was an attempt at human speech, filtered through the wrong anatomy, through physics that didn't belong there. Leo and Miguel froze, their bodies rigid as statues. Every theory, every excuse they'd built to protect themselves from the truth collapsed in an instant. Raccoons don't imitate speech. Wind doesn't form phonemes. That was a voice without a corresponding body in the catalog of biology. The campfire crackled, an absurdly normal sound amid the horror surrounding them. The look they exchanged held no doubt now, only pure, crystalline terror. The forest wasn't just alive, it was speaking to them. And then the voice returned, clearer this time. The prolonged A was followed by a sibilant sound and a sharp click. K. It wasn't a recognizable word. It sounded like a fragment, a piece of audio stolen and reproduced imperfectly. The cadence was completely unnatural, with erratic pauses between sounds, like a machine learning to speak for the first time, using their fears as study material. The intelligence behind it was undeniable. This wasn't an echo. It wasn't an animal. It was perverse mimicry, an acoustic mockery. The panic that set in wasn't the kind that makes you scream. It was a cold, paralyzing panic. Adrenaline flooded their systems, but their limbs refused to obey. They were trapped in a theater of the absurd, with an invisible audience and a lone actor in the dark. Every falling leaf, every shadow dancing with the fire, felt like an extension of that entity. The sensation of being watched, once a subtle paranoia, was now a crushing certainty. They weren't explorers. They were rats in a maze, and the thing observing them was growing tired of the game. The sound moved. Before, it had come from one direction. Now, the same guttural sound, echoed instantly from the opposite side of the camp, as if the speaker could teleport. Then a third sound, directly above them. The voice wasn't circling the camp. It was everywhere at once. Logic shattered. Miguel finally broke the silence, his voice a trembling whisper. Leo, it's inside the tent. But before Leo could process the sentence, another sound cut the air. The zipper of their tent, slowly opening from the inside. The paralyzing panic gave way to an urgent need for action. The voice, that sonic aberration, didn't repeat itself, but its memory haunted the air. Standing still meant accepting the role of prey. The decision was a silent pact, sealed by glances in the flickering firelight. They had to look. They had to confront the darkness, even if it meant finding what hid within it. Logic yielded to the most primal instinct of all: see the predator before it strikes. Inaction was no longer an option. It was a death sentence. Stepping beyond the perimeter of the fire was like diving into an ocean of ink. Every step was a victory over the instinct to retreat. Flashlights tore through the night, their nervous beams turning the familiar woods into a maze of shadows. They moved as one, a fragile unit of human warmth against the supernatural cold, following the direction from which the sound had come. The air was heavy, charged with the inescapable feeling of being watched, every movement recorded by an invisible, omnipresent presence in the surrounding darkness. That's when a beam of light froze on the damp ground. A mark, a footprint. The relief of finding something tangible was instantly pulverized by its impossible shape. It matched no known animal. The impression was long, with 3 thin, pointed toes embedded in the earth, but without the curve of claws. Its symmetry was disturbing, almost artificial in its precision. It was a hieroglyph left by something that didn't belong to this world, a visitor from an unknown and terrifying branch of the tree of life, walking through the forest as if it were its domain. Fear and curiosity fused, driving them to follow the trail. What it revealed was more terrifying than any creature. The footprints led nowhere. They formed a perfect circle around the camp, a methodical patrol along the exact boundary between light and shadow. The spacing was regular, the stride calm, suggesting cold, observant intelligence. It wasn't lost or hunting, it was guarding. The realization hit hard. They were being studied, contained within their own camp by an invisible sentry. They completed the circle and returned to the starting point. But reality unraveled. In the middle of the pristine trail, the footprints simply stopped. One final mark was there, deep and clear in the mud. One step ahead, where the next should have been, the ground was untouched. No crushed leaves, no disturbed soil. There was no sign of a leap or flight. The trail didn't end. It evaporated, as if the being that made it had dematerialized mid-step, leaving only physical proof of an event that defied existence itself. The air grew heavy, dense with the unspoken. The footprints that led nowhere left a void at the center of their logic, and in that void, fear began to crystallize. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful, it was expectant. Each of them felt the weight of an invisible gaze on the back of their necks. The campfire, once comforting, now felt like a spotlight on a dark stage, exposing them as the center of unwanted attention. The heat of the flames could no longer reach the chill settling in their bones. Then the first sound tore through the stillness. Not the subtle crack of a dry branch under an animal's paw. It was a sharp, violent crack, like a thick, living branch being snapped with deliberate force. It came from the east, deep in the darkness. They all turned, hearts pounding. Before they could process it, an identical sound echoed from the west, a macabre response from the opposite side. There wasn't time for any animal to cross that distance. The realization was instant and horrifying. It wasn't just one thing. What followed was a methodical cacophony. A third crack to the north, a fourth to the south. The sequence quickened, filling the spaces between the cardinal points. Branches broke, leaves were crushed. A percussive, threatening rhythm drawing a perfect circle around them. A siege was forming in real time, a border of sound closing in inexorably. Each new noise was another nail hammered into the coffin of their safety, a demonstration of power that reduced them to helpless prey at the center of the arena. That's when their eyes, already straining to pierce the darkness, caught movement. Not clear figures, but anomalies at the edge of vision. Shadows peeling away from shadows, moving with predatory fluidity at the precise boundary where the firelight died. They were fast, almost subliminal, glimpses of something tall and slender slipping between trunks. The dancing flames created their own ghosts, but this was different. It had purpose. It was the visual counterpart to the wall of sound imprisoning them, the confirmation that what hunted them had form. The sensation of being watched evolved into something more visceral, the certainty of being cornered. The perimeter of noise was now constant, an unbreakable auditory barrier. The silhouettes in the darkness seemed bolder, testing the limits of the light, advancing and retreating in a sinister ballet. The camp was no longer a refuge. It was a trap they'd built themselves. The air vibrated with palpable hostility, patient intelligence that had finished observing. The hunt had begun, and they were undeniably the prey. The silence that followed the chaos was almost worse than the noise. The cracking of branches stopped as abruptly as it began, leaving a sound vacuum that felt heavy, dense. The forest wasn't quiet. It was muted. A silence. Miguel and Leo stood motionless, backs pressed together, every muscle taut, ears strained for any hint of movement. The fire, once comforting, now seemed fragile, its light a tiny island in a sea of predatory darkness. The air was charged with terrible electricity, the sense that the invisible predator had merely retreated into the shadows, changing tactics, preparing a much subtler and more perverse attack. The physical war was over. The war for sanity was about to begin. Then a sound cut through the stillness, faint, almost a whisper in the wind, but unmistakably a voice. Miguel. Miguel's body stiffened, blood freezing in his veins. The voice, it was Leo's. It came from the dense darkness to his left, sounding distant and weak, as if injured. Instinctively, he turned, then stopped mid-motion. Leo was right there, sitting beside him, pale in the firelight, eyes wide with pure terror. Leo's mouth hadn't moved. He slowly shook his head, a silent, desperate no. The voice that called was a perfect copy, but something was wrong with its timbre, a cold resonance, a lifeless cadence. It wasn't a plea for help. It was bait. The terror deepened, more visceral. The entity wasn't just surrounding them physically. It was invading the most sacred space they had, mutual trust. It was using Leo's voice, the sound Miguel trusted most in the world, as a weapon to lure him into the darkness. It was calculated cruelty, psychological torture beyond any physical threat. If it could imitate Leo, it could imitate anyone. It could whisper in the voices of parents, of a child, exploiting the deepest connections of the human psyche to lead its prey to ruin. The forest became a theater of psychological horror. If you've ever felt an unexplained chill down your spine, leave a like on this video. And comment below, what's the scariest sound you've ever heard in the dark? The voice sounded again, clearer, more insistent. Miguel, help me. I'm stuck here. The intonation was perfect, carrying just the right amount of panic and pain to trigger every protective instinct in Miguel's body. His rational mind screamed that it was impossible, that Leo was inches away. But the primitive part of his brain, shaped by millennia of evolution to respond to a companion's distress, was at war. He looked at the real Leo and saw the reflection of his own fear in his friend's eyes, but also a flicker of doubt. The seed of distrust had been planted. What if the one beside him was the imposter? The idea was absurd, but in that abyss of fear, logic was a weak, flickering flame. It was Leo who broke the spell. He reached out and grabbed Miguel's arm with surprising strength. The contact was real, warm, human. He said nothing, but his gaze was a manifesto. Don't believe it. I'm here. It's a trap. At that moment, the voice in the forest called a third time. Its tone now cracked by a pathetic sob, a masterful performance of vulnerability. But it was too late. The physical touch, the undeniable reality of his friend's presence, had shattered the illusion. They understood the enemy's strategy: isolate, divide, conquer. Together, they huddled closer to the fire, their only anchor to reality. While the darkness echoed with the ghostly voice of a friend, a siren song promising nothing but a solitary end. The echo of the false Leo's voice lingered in the cold air, a lie clinging to the silence that followed. Miguel and Leo remained motionless, side by side, yet separated by a universe. The entity's trick had worked better than any physical attack. It planted paralyzing doubt. Every dancing shadow, every crackle of the fire, was now potential betrayal. Trust, their only true weapon against the unknown, was fractured. They didn't look at each other. Both stared into the impenetrable darkness surrounding their small circle of light, waiting for the next psychological assault. The forest, once background, now felt conscious, a predator toying with its prey before the final blow, savoring the fear radiating from the camp. It was an almost imperceptible movement that broke the spell. A subtle shift in Miguel's peripheral vision. An anomaly in the rhythmic dance of shadows cast by the fire. Not a branch breaking or leaves stirring, but something more fundamental. An absence of light where there should have been. His gaze locked onto the spot between two old beeches. At the same instant he felt Leo tense beside him, body taut as steel wire. Leo had seen it too. It wasn't an illusion, not a trick of exhaustion or fear. It was real. Both held their breath, a shared silence confirming mutual terror, transforming the doubt between them into certainty united by absolute panic. There, at the exact boundary between light and total darkness, stood a shape. For a fraction of a second stretched into eternity, the flickering firelight outlined it. It was tall, grotesquely tall, its silhouette stretching upward in a way that defied known anatomy. Thin, almost a charcoal line against the night, with limbs too long, disproportionate to its torso. Its posture was rigid, unnatural, like a broken statue poorly reassembled. No details were visible, no eyes, no face, just a contour that screamed wrong to the primal brain. It didn't move. It simply stood there, perfectly still, watching them. A sentinel from a place that didn't belong to this world. Its presence a silent violation of reality. The sight of that motionless figure was the shock needed to break paralysis. Psychological terror, the fear of the unknown, was instantly replaced by visceral, primal dread of what was undeniably real and present. All the games of voice imitation and fleeting shadows now felt like mere preludes to this revelation. That thing wasn't just hunting them. It was studying them. And now, for some reason, it had decided to reveal itself. Miguel and Leo exchanged a single look. No words were needed. In that glance was a tacit agreement, forged in pure terror. Nothing here was worth it. The tent, the gear, the food, everything was insignificant compared to that presence. The only thing that mattered was distance. Instinct took over. In a synchronized, chaotic motion, they stood and ran. They didn't look back. The sound of their feet crushing leaves and snapping twigs was the only thing breaking the forest's silence. A sound of desperate panic. They plunged into the darkness opposite the figure, abandoning the safety and warmth of the fire, their last anchor of sanity. They ran blindly, tripping over roots, whipped by branches, driven only by adrenaline, and the image of that unnatural silhouette burned into their minds. The small island of light shrank quickly behind them, swallowed by the night, leaving them completely at the mercy of the forest and the creature they knew was still watching from afar. Panic was a cold fuel, burning through their veins. There were no words, just a mutual, primal understanding. Run. Miguel gripped the only flashlight, its beam slicing the darkness like a fragile blade. Leo followed close behind, the sound of his footsteps and ragged breathing the only proof he wasn't alone. They plunged into the woods, and the forest swallowed them instantly. The air thickened, the leafy canopy blocking what little moonlight there was, plunging them into near-total darkness. Hope, embodied in that cone of light, didn't last long. After minutes of blind running, the flashlight began to fail. The beam flickered, turning into a sickly, intermittent blink. Each flash revealed a nightmare of twisted trunks and shadows dancing like specters. Each moment of darkness between flashes was a chasm of terror, a blind second where anything could approach. Miguel shook the device desperately, but the flicker only grew more erratic, weaker, like the final beats of a dying heart. Technology had abandoned them. Worse than the darkness was the betrayal of the path. The trail that should have been their escape route simply vanished. Packed earth gave way to slick leaves and treacherous roots. Trees once spaced for passage now seemed to have closed in, forming an impenetrable wall in every direction. It was as if the geography itself were reconfiguring to confuse them, to erase all traces of civilization and ensure the labyrinth had no exit. Every step was a plunge into the unknown. Then the sounds wove their trap. A branch crack sounded too close, first to the right, then impossibly to the left. A low murmur, barely audible, seemed to follow them, vibrating through the soles of their shoes. These weren't the normal noises of a nocturnal forest. It was a cacophony designed to disorient. The imitated voices returned, now distorted, whispers in the wind from all directions at once, guiding them deeper, farther from any hope of salvation. The final blow came in the form of a familiar sight. Exhausted and scraped, they stumbled out of dense woods and stopped, gasping. The dying beam of the flashlight swept the area, illuminating the nearly extinguished fire and the remains of their abandoned camp. They hadn't advanced. They hadn't escaped. For hours they'd moved in a perfect circle, guided by darkness, sound, and the malevolent will of that place. The forest wasn't an obstacle. It was a prison, and it wouldn't let them leave. Retreat wasn't a choice. It was surrender. Each step back toward the clearing was an admission of defeat, a recognition that the forest didn't just watch them, it herded them. The path that had refused to appear now revealed itself with mocking clarity, guiding them back to the fragile nylon dome of their tent. Entering and zipping it shut was the final act of capitulation. The sound of the zipper echoed in the silence, a metallic click sealing their fate, locking them in not to protect them from outside, but to imprison them with fear. Inside, the air grew heavy and stale, every breath a conscious effort against the crushing pressure of what waited beyond the thin fabric. The silence that followed was worse than noise. It was an active silence, expectant, the calm before the storm. Every distant branch crack, every whisper of wind was amplified. Then terror began with a sound that didn't belong, a slow, almost hesitant scraping against the tent wall, like a fingernail dragged along taut fabric, dry, intimate, deliberate. They held their breath, hearts pounding. The sound stopped. Then, elsewhere, it resumed. This wasn't an animal. An animal would be random, frightened. This was methodical, curious, examining its fragile cage. Curiosity turned to violence without warning. A dull, powerful impact slammed into the side of the tent, throwing them against each other in the dark. The fiberglass poles groaned under the strain, bending dangerously. It wasn't a shove. It was a blow, delivered with force and malice. Then the shaking began. The entire tent was rocked back and forth with rhythmic, relentless fury. It was like being inside a toy in the hands of a giant, enraged entity. The world became a blur of shadows and panic. The sound of nylon snapping through the air mixed with their muffled screams as they clung to the ground for stability. Amid the physical chaos, the psychological attack began. Whispers, at first so faint they could have been leaves brushing or fabric rubbing, but they grew, enveloping the tent from all sides. It wasn't a single voice, but a chorus of overlapping murmurs, a tangle of sibilant sounds mimicking human speech cadence without forming recognizable words. Guttural, rough sounds that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The voices slid across the fabric and into their minds, sowing madness that physical terror alone couldn't achieve. They covered their ears. It was useless. The sound didn't come only from outside. It echoed inside their skulls. The attack reached a deafening crescendo. The violent shaking, frantic scratching, and profane chorus merged into an overwhelming symphony of terror. Reality dissolved. There was no up or down, inside or out, just a vortex of movement, sound, and panic. Their minds, pushed to the brink, began to fracture. They huddled at the center, trembling, waiting for the inevitable tear in the fabric. And then, at the height of fury, everything stopped. Silence fell like a guillotine. Absolute. The contrast was shocking. Movement ceased. Whispers vanished. They lay motionless in the dark, breath held, knowing that the absence of sound was the greatest threat. It was a pause. The night wasn't over, and then it stopped. As abruptly as it began, the pandemonium ceased. Not a gradual fade, not a final whisper, like a switch flipped, plunging the forest into a vacuum of sound. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, dense, pressing against their eardrums with palpable absence. The silence of a predator that has stopped growling and now simply watches, waiting for the slightest movement. Inside, motionless and huddled, they barely dared breathe. Each heartbeat sounded like a drum in the void, a beacon announcing they were still there, alive and terrified. The night hadn't ended. It had merely changed tactics. The first light of dawn didn't break the darkness with promise. It seeped through the fabric like a gray intruder, a weak light bringing no warmth, only revealing dust in the air and their pale faces. That light seemed to be the trigger. With the first rays, the oppressive sense of presence didn't vanish, but receded. like a dark tide forced back into the depths. They remained silent for minutes that stretched into hours, listening to nothing. Birds didn't return, leaves didn't rustle. It was a stage silence, artificial intense, as if nature itself held its breath with them. No words were exchanged. A single look was enough, a desperate understanding, now or never. Movement began slow, then became a frantic, silent dance of survival. Backpacks grabbed, sleeping bags kicked aside. No time to organize, just essentials. Wallets, car keys, a water bottle. Each zipper sounded like a scream, each rustle of fabric, a challenge to the sepulchral quiet. The fear of night was replaced by dread of what day would reveal, and dread that the silence was only a pause before the final act. Escape was the priority. Opening the tent zipper was the bravest act they'd ever committed. The fabric parted to reveal a senseless world. The clearing was untouched. No broken branches, no disturbed leaves, not a single footprint in the damp earth but their own. The forest looked serene under pale light, a painting mocking the hell they'd endured. It denied their reality, suggesting it had all been a delusion. But then their eyes fell on the tent itself. Thin, deep slashes marred the fabric. 3 parallel lines, too precise for any animal. Irrefutable proof the attack had been real. They didn't run. Running invited panic. They walked with quick, deliberate steps, a rhythm driven by adrenaline and terror. There was an unspoken rule, forged in fear: don't look back. Looking back meant acknowledging pursuit, giving power to whatever watched from shadows the light couldn't reach. The trail, which had vanished the night before, was now clear and unmistakable, a path to salvation. But that clarity itself was a trap. It seemed too easy. With every step they felt the weight of eyes on their backs, the sense they were being allowed to leave, that the forest hadn't been defeated, only releasing them. For now. Run. It was the only word, the only instinct, left in their exhausted minds. Each branch snapping underfoot sounded like a bone breaking, each gust of wind like a pursuing whisper. The forest, once refuge, was now a labyrinth of invisible teeth and claws. The cold, damp morning air burned their lungs, but they didn't dare stop. The distance to the car felt infinite, an ocean of trees and shadows threatening to swallow them at every step. Fear was no longer an emotion. It was fuel, a primal force screaming for survival. Finally, through fog and foliage, they saw the metallic outline of the vehicle, an artifact of a sane, safe world they'd left behind. Miguel's hands shook so badly he could barely fit the key into the lock. The click of the door unlocking was the loudest, most relieving sound they'd ever heard. They threw themselves inside, slamming the doors with enough force to shake the car. Locked. For one instant, just one, they allowed themselves to breathe. But the silence outside was as oppressive as the night's noises. The key turned in the ignition. Nothing. A metallic click. And silence. Panic surged back, cold and overwhelming. Again. The engine coughed, protested, then roared to life, ripping through the morning quiet. Without thinking, Miguel floored the accelerator, tires screaming in the dirt as the car shot down the trail, leaving the clearing and its unspeakable secrets behind. The transition from dirt road to asphalt was like crossing between worlds. The sun now shone brightly, revealing ordinary scenery, sleepy commuters heading to work, the banality of daily life. Inside the car, however, night still reigned. Neither spoke. What could they say? How do you put absolute terror, violation of all rational laws, into words? A glance was exchanged, a silent pact of acknowledgement. They'd survived, but were broken. The shared experience bound them in a trauma no one else could understand. An island of fear amid an ocean of normalcy. The radio stayed off. The only sound was the engine carrying them away from a place that would forever be etched into their souls. They never returned. For months they tried to find a logical explanation. A wild animal, a local playing an elaborate prank, collective hysteria induced by fear and darkness. Each theory unraveled against the visceral memory of that night. The true horror, they realized, wasn't what they saw or heard, but what they didn't see. The absence of form, motive, or answer was more terrifying than any monster. The forest hadn't given them an enemy to fight, but an abyss of uncertainty. And it was in that abyss their minds now lived, replaying every sound, every shadow, searching for a clue that never existed. That night left a scar, not on skin, but on their perception of reality itself. For Leo and Miguel, the world was never entirely safe. Again, they learned that there are places on the map where the rules of our understanding simply don't apply, where the veil between the known and the impossible is dangerously thin. They carry the weight of that darkness, a constant reminder that the greatest fear isn't what hides in the shadows, but the terrifying possibility that the shadows are all there is. If you also feel there's more between heaven and earth than our vain philosophy can explain, subscribe, because our next investigation will explore a story that might be happening right now, in the house next door.